The last light of the afternoon had already failed by the time Arthur Pembury arrived at King's Cross Station. It was 4 o'clock on a Friday in the second week of November, 1906, and London had spent the entire day under a sky the color of old pewter. It was a low sky, a heavy sky, a featureless expanse of gray that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single break or variation. This sky had never quite managed to produce rain throughout the long hours of the day, but it had succeeded, with characteristic English determination, in making everything beneath it feel thoroughly and persistently damp. The gas lamps along Euston Road had been lit since 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They cast their amber circles onto the wet pavement below, where the reflections trembled in the thin film of water like small uncertain flames struggling to stay alive against the encroaching darkness of the November evening. King's Cross Station rose before Arthur like a monument to the age of steam and iron. Its great arched facade was constructed of yellow London brick, though decades of soot from countless locomotives had darkened its surface to something approaching the color of weak tea. The station possessed twin round windows set high in its facade, and these windows glowed faintly from within. Arthur thought they resembled the eyes of an enormous patient creature watching the city go about its business with ancient and unhurried attention. Hansom cabs and motor cars jostled for position at the station entrance, their drivers calling out to passengers and competing for fares. Arthur observed this scene with the detached interest of a man who had witnessed the world change around him and had learned to accept these changes without complaint. The old world and the new, he thought, still negotiating the terms of their coexistence. Porters in dark uniforms moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, their movements economical and purposeful. These were men who had learned to carry other people's burdens without comment, who understood that their role was to smooth the passage of travelers from the chaos of the street to the order of the platform. Arthur paid his cabman the fare and added a modest tip, neither generous nor mean, but precisely appropriate to the service rendered and the distance traveled. He collected his single piece of luggage from the cab's interior and stepped down onto the wet pavement. The luggage was a leather Gladstone bag of considerable age and modest size. Its brass clasps had been polished to a dull gleam, not bright enough to catch the eye, but maintained with the quiet care of a man who believed that possessions should be looked after properly. Arthur walked through the entrance of the station and into the great interior space beyond. He was 64 years old, a man of medium height and lean build, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that resembled, in its lines and contours, one of the maps he had spent his life making. There were ridges and valleys in that face, contour lines of experience drawn by sun and wind and rain, by long days of walking across open country with a theodolite on his shoulder and a chain in his hand. His hair, once dark as the ink he used to draw coastlines, was now entirely white. It was cut short and brushed back from a high forehead, and it gave him the appearance of a man who had made his peace with the passage of time. His eyes were gray, a clear, observant gray that missed very little of what passed before them. Behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, these eyes carried the particular expression of a man who had spent decades looking at things very carefully and had developed, as a consequence of this careful looking, the habit of seeing more than most people saw. Where others might glance at a hillside and see merely a slope covered in grass and heather, Arthur would see the underlying geology, the drainage patterns, the way the contours folded into one another, the optimal path for a road or a railway, the precise angle at which the afternoon light would fall across the western face. He wore a dark charcoal wool overcoat against the November chill. Beneath this coat he wore a three-piece suit of navy blue serge, well cut but not fashionable, the kind of suit that a professional man might wear for decades without ever appearing either stylish or out of date. His shirt was white cotton with a stiff turned-down collar, and his necktie was burgundy silk, knotted with the precise, unshowy competence of a man who had been tying the same knot for 40 years. On his head he wore a dark gray felt Homburg hat, its brim slightly curved, its crown slightly dented, its overall appearance suggesting a hat that had accompanied its owner through many years and many journeys. On his feet, he wore black leather Oxford shoes that had been resoled twice and polished that very morning. In his left hand, he carried the Gladstone bag. In his right hand, he carried a mahogany walking stick with a brass ferrule. He carried this stick not out of infirmity, for his legs were still strong and his balance still sure, but out of habit and sentiment. The stick had been his father's, and before that his grandfather's. Arthur Pembury was a man who believed that some things should be carried forward from generation to generation, not because they were valuable in any material sense, but because they connected the present to the past in ways that mattered even if those ways could not be precisely articulated. He had retired 18 months ago from the Ordnance Survey, where he had served for 41 years. 41 years of his life, he sometimes thought, reduced to lines on paper, to symbols and abbreviations, to the precise notation of distance and height and angle. In the last 12 of those years, he had held the position of principal cartographer for the northern counties, a title that meant something to the perhaps 200 people in England who understood what cartographers did and how they did it, and meant nothing at all to everyone else. In his time with the survey, Arthur had walked more than 15,000 miles of English, Scottish, and Welsh countryside. 15,000 miles, he had once calculated during a sleepless night, was roughly equivalent to walking from London to Calcutta and back again. He had worn out more boots than he could count, broken 3 theodolites, lost 2 compasses, and contracted pneumonia twice. He had measured, triangulated, sketched, and recorded the shape of the land with an accuracy that left no hedgerow uncharted, no stream unnamed, no contour line misplaced by more than the width of a pencil stroke. The maps he had made were used by farmers and soldiers, by engineers and explorers, by anyone who needed to know the shape of the ground beneath their feet. His maps would outlast him, he knew, would continue to guide travelers long after his bones had returned to the earth that he had spent his life recording. The interior of King's Cross was vast and echoing, a cathedral of iron and glass and steam. Arthur paused just inside the entrance to take in the scale of the space, as he always paused, as he had paused on his first visit to this station 40 years ago, and on every visit since. The great arched roof soared overhead, its ribs of wrought iron curving upward into the gloom where the gas lamps could not quite reach. Between these iron ribs, panels of glass let in what remained of the November daylight, which was very little indeed. Many of these glass panels were grimy with the accumulated soot of half a century of locomotive smoke. The railway had built this station, Arthur thought, and the railway was slowly darkening it, coating it layer by layer with the residue of its own breath. And everywhere, threading through the human noise like a bass note beneath a melody, was the sound of steam. The hissing, sighing, breathing sound of engines at rest, their boilers ticking as they cooled or warmed, their pistons still and silent, gathering strength for the journeys ahead. Their great iron bodies stood patient and powerful, waiting for the signal that would send them thundering out into the night. Arthur consulted the departure board, a large wooden structure mounted on the wall of the station, its letters and numbers arranged in slots that could be changed as trains departed and new services were announced. The 9:15 night express to Edinburgh, he read, calling at Peterborough, Grantham, York, Darlington, Newcastle, and Berwick-upon-Tweed. Departing from platform 3. The sleeping car was at the rear of the train. He had 40 minutes before departure. The locomotive was positioned at the head of platform 3, and Arthur, as was his habit, paused to look at it as he passed. He was not a railway enthusiast in any systematic sense. He did not collect locomotive numbers or memorize timetables or belong to any of the societies that had sprung up to celebrate the Iron Horse. But he believed that any machine capable of carrying human beings through the night at 60 miles per hour across 390 miles of countryside deserved a moment of respectful attention. The locomotive was painted in the deep green of the Great Northern Railway, a color that Arthur had always found particularly handsome, rich and dark like the needles of a pine forest in winter. Gold lining picked out the edges of the boiler and the cab, adding a touch of elegance to the functional bulk of the machine. The brass fittings on the smokebox door and the handrails caught the light from the platform lamps and threw it back in small warm sparks. Steam rose from the safety valve in a thin white column, dissolving into the cold November air. The sleeping car was a 12-wheeled vehicle, longer and heavier than the ordinary carriages, built by the North Eastern Railway's workshops at York. It was, Arthur thought as he approached it, a rather handsome thing. Its body was paneled in teak, that durable tropical hardwood that the railways favored for its resistance to weather and its ability to take a high polish. The teak had been varnished to a rich dark brown that glowed warmly under the platform lamps, as though the wood itself contained some inner source of light. The sides of the car were lined with windows, small square windows, each one curtained in dark green fabric that matched the locomotive's livery. These curtain windows gave the sleeping car the appearance of a very long, very narrow country house lying on its side. Arthur thought of the great houses he had seen during his years of surveying, the manor houses of Yorkshire and the tower houses of the Scottish borders, and he saw in this sleeping car a kind of portable domesticity, a home on wheels, designed to carry its inhabitants through the darkness in warmth and comfort while the world outside rushed past unseen. The roof was a smooth curve of painted canvas, practical and unornamented. The running boards below the doors were edged in brass, and the destination board mounted above the nearest door read, in cream letters on a chocolate-brown background, King's Cross to Edinburgh Waverley, sleeping car. Good evening, sir. Name, please. Pembury. Arthur Pembury. Compartment 6. The attendant consulted his clipboard, found Arthur's name on the list, and made a small, precise tick with his pencil. Compartment 6? Yes, sir. Third door on your left. I'll bring your tea at 7, unless you'd prefer earlier. 7 will be perfect, Arthur said. Thank you. Fenton, sir. Thomas Fenton. Thank you, Fenton. He stepped up into the sleeping car, his hand grasping the brass handrail, his foot finding the step with the ease of long practice. The corridor of the sleeping car was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, without turning sideways. It was paneled, like the exterior, in dark polished wood, though here the wood was mahogany rather than teak. The mahogany had been finished to a high shine that reflected the gaslight from the small brass fittings on the walls. Arthur saw his own reflection in the polished wood, a dim ghost of himself walking beside him down the corridor. The floor was carpeted in deep maroon, thick enough to absorb footsteps, to create an atmosphere of hushed intimacy. The air smelled of furniture polish, clean linen, and the faint pervasive not unpleasant smell of coal smoke that permeated every railway carriage in England. Arthur found compartment 6 and opened the door. The compartment was small, 6 feet long, and perhaps 4 feet wide, but it contained everything a person might need for a night's journey. There was a bed already made up, running lengthwise against the outer wall of the carriage, covered in white linen sheets, crisp and clean, and a dark green wool blanket that matched the curtains in the corridor. There was a pillow, plump and freshly cased in white cotton. There was a small fold-down shelf beneath the window on which sat a carafe of water and a drinking glass. There was a brass hook on the back of the door for hanging clothes. There was a small mahogany cabinet beside the bed with a mirror mounted on its inside door so that a passenger could check their appearance before stepping out into the corridor. The window looked out onto the platform and was fitted with a green curtain on a brass rail. Beside the window, at the head of the bed, was a small gas lamp with an adjustable flame mounted in a brass gimbal so that it would remain level regardless of the motion of the train, a clever piece of engineering that Arthur appreciated. Arthur set his Gladstone bag on the bed and removed his Homburg hat. He hung the hat on the brass hook on the back of the door where it would remain until morning. Then he sat down on the bed and looked around the compartment. The compartment, despite its dimensions, did not feel cramped. It felt, Arthur thought, like a well-designed cabin on a ship, compact and efficient, every surface serving a purpose, every fitting placed with care. He had slept in many such compartments over the years during his long career with the Ordnance Survey. The work of mapping the northern counties had required frequent journeys between London and the field offices in York, Newcastle, and Edinburgh. He had taken the night train more times than he could count, had fallen asleep to the rhythm of the rails more often than he had fallen asleep in his own bed. He knew the particular comfort of a sleeping car, the way it enclosed you, wrapped you in its narrow warmth, the way it rocked you with the rhythm of the rails, gentle and persistent, the way it carried you through the night while you slept, so that you woke in the morning in a different place, a different landscape, as though the hours of darkness had been not merely time but distance, not merely rest but transformation. He opened the Gladstone bag and began to unpack with the methodical care of a man who had packed and unpacked the same bag 1,000 times. First his nightshirt, white cotton, plain, folded with military precision. He placed it on the pillow where it would be ready when he was ready to sleep. Second, his shaving kit, a leather roll containing a razor, a brush, a cake of soap, and a small hand mirror. He would not need this until morning, but he placed it in the mahogany cabinet where it would be easy to find. Third, his slippers, brown leather, soft-soled, comfortable for the short walks along the corridor that a night on a train sometimes required. He placed these on the floor beside the bed. Fourth, a book. This evening, it was Stevenson's Kidnapped, which Arthur was rereading for the fourth time because he believed that a good book, like a good map, revealed new details with each reading. He placed the book on the fold-down shelf beside the water carafe. And finally, wrapped in a square of oilcloth at the bottom of the bag, a brass compass. It was not a surveyor's instrument, not one of the precision devices he had used in his professional work. It was a simple pocket compass, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. Its needle trembled faintly under its glass, pointing north. Always pointing north. He unwrapped the compass and placed it on the fold-down shelf beside the book. He did this every time he traveled, a small ritual, a way of knowing where he was even in the dark. The compass had belonged to his father, and before that to his grandfather. It was not particularly valuable, and it was not particularly accurate, but it had accompanied 3 generations of Pembury men on their journeys, and Arthur found its presence comforting in a way that he could not entirely explain, but did not feel the need to. He changed out of his overcoat and suit jacket, hanging them carefully on the brass hook beside his hat. Then he sat on the edge of the bed in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves and looked out the window at the platform. The compartment was warm. The heating pipes that ran along the base of the wall were already doing their work, filling the small space with a gentle, pervasive warmth. And this warmth, combined with the snugness of the space and the soft gaslight from the little brass lamp, created an atmosphere of enclosure and safety that Arthur found deeply, almost childishly comforting. It was, he reflected, one of the paradoxes of travel. That movement could feel like stillness. That the act of being carried through the night in a metal box on wheels could produce a sensation of peace more profound than any he felt in his own house in Highgate, where the rooms were large and the bed was stationary, and the silence was the silence of a man alone. He had been alone since the death of his wife Catherine 4 years ago this coming January. They had been married for 36 years. 36 years of shared meals and shared silences, of conversations that could be conducted in half-sentences because each knew what the other would say, of small kindnesses and occasional arguments, and a deep unspoken understanding that comes from decades of proximity. In that time Catherine had been, and here he searched for the right word as he always searched for the right word, with the precision of a man who believed that language like cartography should be accurate. Catherine had been his cardinal point, his north, the fixed reference from which all other directions were measured. Without her, the compass of his daily life still functioned. The needle still moved, still pointed toward something, but it had lost somehow the certainty of its readings. He navigated by habit now, by memory, by the accumulated momentum of decades of routine. He was not unhappy. Unhappiness required a kind of energy that he no longer possessed. He was simply unmapped, living in territory that he had not yet learned to chart. A whistle blew somewhere along the platform, a sharp, clear note that cut through the ambient noise of the station like a pen stroke across a blank page. Decisive, definitive, a mark that could not be erased. Then a pause, a held breath. The station seemed to wait, seemed to gather itself for the moment of departure. And then the first movement. It was barely perceptible at first, less a movement than a suggestion of movement. A faint tremor in the woodwork, a slight shifting of the water in the carafe on the fold-down shelf, a barely audible change in the quality of the silence. And then the platform began to slide. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the lamps and the pillars and the faces of the people who had come to see the train off began to move backward, as though the station itself were departing and the train was standing still. Arthur watched through the window as King's Cross withdrew around him. The platform slid away. The roof retreated. The great arched facade grew smaller and smaller. And then the train was out, emerging into the open air, into the November night, into the vast dark sprawl of London. The gaslit streets and terrace houses, the factory chimneys dark against the darker sky, began to flow past the window in a slow, continuous scroll, like a map unrolling, Arthur thought. a map of a city he knew well made strange by darkness and motion. The rhythm of the train established itself within minutes. It was a steady, rocking, hypnotic rhythm, the rhythm of a train at speed, composed of 100 small sounds woven together into a single continuous pulse. The wheels on the rails provided the foundation, a paired beat, a double heartbeat. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. Regular as breathing, predictable as the tide. Above this foundation, other sounds added their voices. The slight creak of the woodwork as the carriage swayed on its springs. The faint rattle of the water carafe against the glass on the fold-down shelf. The whisper of air passing along the outside of the train. And beneath everything, felt rather than heard, the deep, steady vibration of the locomotive ahead, pulling its load of carriages and sleeping passengers through the night with the tireless mechanical patience of a creature that does not need to rest. Arthur sat by the window with the green curtain drawn back, watching London thin and fade. The terrace houses gave way to villas, each one set back from the road in its own small garden. The villas gave way to allotments, those patches of cultivated ground where working men grew vegetables and escaped for a few hours each week the confines of their urban lives. The allotments gave way to open fields, dark and formless in the November night. And then quite suddenly the city was gone, replaced by darkness. A deep rural darkness unpunctuated by street lamps, broken only by the occasional cluster of lights that marked a village or a farmstead. Each cluster appeared and vanished in a matter of seconds, like a brief bright thought in a mind that was slowly drifting toward sleep. Arthur unwrapped a peppermint and placed it in his cheek. The sharp, clean taste of peppermint spread across his tongue. He opened his Stevenson and read by the light of the little brass lamp. The familiar words of kidnapped washed over him like water over stones. And the train carried him north. At 10 o'clock, there was a gentle knock on his compartment door. The door opened 6 inches, and the sleeping car attendant appeared in the gap. It was the same tall, thin man who had greeted Arthur on the platform. He was still immaculate, still gloved, his expression one of professional solicitude. "Tea would be welcome," Arthur said. "And if there's a biscuit to be had, I wouldn't refuse one." "Very good, sir. Milk and sugar. Just milk. Thank you." The door closed with a soft click, and Arthur returned to his book, though he found that his attention was drifting from the page to the window. The darkness beyond the glass had acquired a new quality, a faint luminescence in the east that might have been the moon rising behind the clouds, or might have been the distant glow of Peterborough's lights, or might have been nothing at all. Just the eye's attempt to find light where there was none. The train slowed as it approached Peterborough. The rhythm changed from the steady pulse of speed to the longer, more deliberate cadence of deceleration. The wheels seemed to sigh as they eased against the rails, and the carriage settled into a gentle rocking drift, like a boat coming into harbor. The train stopped. The silence after the hours of rhythmic motion was startling. A sudden, absolute silence that felt paradoxically louder than the noise it replaced. Arthur could hear for the first time the small sounds of the sleeping car. A cough from a neighboring compartment. The creak of a bed. The footsteps of Fenton moving along the corridor. The distant hiss of the engine releasing steam. A few passengers boarded at Peterborough. He heard their footsteps on the platform, their muffled voices, the click and thud of doors opening and closing. And then from the compartment next to his, compartment 5, he heard the sound of someone settling in. The rustle of a coat being removed. The click of a bag being set down. The soft exhale of a person sitting down on a bed for the first time, testing its give. Fenton arrived with the tea. He carried a small brown teapot on a brass tray along with a white china cup and saucer, a tiny jug of milk, and 2 shortbread biscuits wrapped in waxed paper. He set the tray on the fold-down shelf with the practiced ease of a man who had served tea on moving trains for years and had learned to account for the slight angles and unexpected tilts of a vehicle that was never quite level. "The lady in compartment 5 has also requested tea," Fenton mentioned as he poured Arthur's cup. "She boarded at Peterborough. A Miss Mosley, traveling to Edinburgh." Arthur noted this piece of information without particular interest. He was not an unsociable man, but neither was he the sort who sought out conversation with strangers on trains. He had learned over the years that the sleeping car was a place of private rituals. Each passenger enclosed in their compartment like a letter in an envelope, sealed and self-contained, moving through the night, toward their individual destinations. He thanked Fenton and drank his tea slowly. It was strong and hot, and exactly right. He ate his biscuits with the deliberate, unhurried attention of a man who understood that small pleasures attended to properly are not small at all. The train departed Peterborough, and the rhythm resumed. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. Arthur felt the familiar, irresistible pull of the motion. The way the rocking of the carriage seemed to synchronize with something deep in the body, something ancient and pre-verbal, the memory of being held and rocked as a child. He set aside his book. He turned down the gas lamp until the flame was a small blue-gold bead behind the glass. He lay back on the pillow intending to rest his eyes for a moment. The train passed through Huntingdon without stopping. The night beyond the window was very dark. It was the flat, open darkness of the Cambridgeshire fens, a landscape that Arthur knew well from his years of survey work. A landscape without contour or feature where the sky and the earth merged at an invisible horizon, and the only vertical elements were the church towers and the windmills standing like sentinels in the enormous emptiness. He did not sleep. He rested in that territory between waking and sleeping where the mind releases its hold on the day's concerns and drifts untethered among thoughts that are not quite thoughts. Impressions, images, fragments of memory that surface and dissolve like bubbles in slow water. Catherine's face appeared in his mind, not as she had been at the end, diminished by illness, but as she had been in their early years together, young and dark-haired and quick to laugh. The smell of heather on a hillside in Northumberland came to him next. He had surveyed those hills in the summer of 1889, walking through the purple heather with the sun on his back and the curlews calling overhead. The sound of a curlew calling across a moorland at dusk. That long, liquid, melancholy cry that seemed to contain within it all the loneliness of the high places. The particular blue of the ink he had used for 40 years to draw the coastline on his maps. A blue that was neither the blue of the sky nor the blue of the sea, but something in between, a blue that existed only on maps, only in the space where the cartographer's imagination met the reality of the water. At Grantham the train stopped again. Briefly, no more than 5 minutes. Arthur, who had not quite slept, opened his eyes and looked out at the platform. A single lamp burned at the far end. Beneath it a porter sat on a wooden bench with a newspaper spread across his knees, motionless, as though he were a fixture of the station rather than a person, as though he had been sitting there since the station was built and would continue sitting there until it was pulled down. The train moved on. The flatlands of Lincolnshire gave way gradually to the gentle rolls and swells of the countryside north of Grantham, where the land begins to lift itself out of the fens and to develop the first tentative undulations that will become, 200 miles further north, the hills and mountains of Scotland. Arthur felt this change in the land through the motion of the train, a subtle alteration in the rhythm, a slight increase in the effort of the engine, a barely perceptible tilting of the carriage as the track rose and fell with the contours. He knew this landscape intimately. He had mapped every mile of it, every field boundary and footpath and stream. He could close his eyes and draw it from memory. The shape of the ridges, the curve of the rivers, the way the villages clustered in the valleys and the farms scattered themselves across the higher ground. It was somewhere between Grantham and Newark that Arthur heard the sound from the corridor. Not a troubling sound, nothing alarming or unusual, just the quiet click of a compartment door opening and closing, followed by soft footsteps in the corridor moving toward the rear of the train. He thought nothing of it. Passengers moved about on night trains, to use the lavatory at the end of the carriage, to stretch their legs, or simply because sleep would not come and the confines of the compartment had become for the moment too close. But a few minutes later there was a second sound. The door at the end of the carriage, the one that led to the small, open vestibule between carriages, opened and closed with a brief gust of cold air that Arthur felt even through the closed door of his compartment. Someone had stepped out onto the vestibule, the open platform between carriages where the night air rushed past, and the ground was visible through the gap between the couplings, a place where the train's speed became suddenly viscerally real. Arthur sat up. It was not his business, of course, but it was nearly midnight, and the vestibule was cold and loud and not a place where a person would stand without reason. And the cartographer in him, the man who had spent his life noticing things that other people overlooked, was curious. He put on his slippers. He opened his compartment door. He stepped into the corridor. She was standing at the open vestibule door, leaning on the iron railing, looking out at the night. The wind pulled at her hair and her coat. The noise of the train, the full unfiltered roar of wheels and wind and engine, rushed past her in a torrent of sound that made speech impossible and thought difficult, and made the body aware with every nerve that it was moving through space at extraordinary speed. Arthur stood in the corridor doorway and observed her for a moment. She was younger than he was, late 20s perhaps, and she was dressed in a manner that Arthur found practical rather than fashionable. She wore a dark green wool traveling coat, well cut but not new, buttoned high against the cold. Beneath it he could see the hem of a plain gray wool skirt. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, pinned up but coming loose in the wind, strands of it whipping across her face. Her boots were brown leather, sturdy, the kind worn by people who walk on uneven ground. She was not distressed. Her posture was not that of a person in trouble, but of a person in thought. Her weight was settled on the railing. Her face was turned toward the rushing darkness. Her eyes were open and focused on something that was either very far away or very close. The way people look when they are thinking about something that matters. Arthur cleared his throat, and she turned. "Forgive me," Arthur said, raising his voice above the noise of the train. "I only wanted to be sure you were quite all right." She looked at him with dark eyes, brown almost black, bright with intelligence, and he thought a trace of amusement at his concern. "Perfectly all right, thank you. I was looking for the Pleiades." "I beg your pardon?" "The Pleiades, the star cluster in Taurus. They should be visible tonight. The cloud cover broke north of Grantham, and the seeing should be excellent this far from London. But the vibration of the train makes it rather difficult to hold a steady gaze." She paused, and then added with a directness that Arthur found both startling and refreshing. "I am an astronomer. I look at stars. It is what I do." She extended her hand. It was an unusual gesture from a woman in this era, but she performed it with such natural confidence that it did not seem unusual at all. "Clara Mosley. I work at the Kielder Observatory in Northumberland. Well, I say work. I am the only woman on the staff, which means I do the work of two people and am paid for the work of half of one. But the stars don't mind who's looking at them, so it evens out." Arthur shook her hand. It was cold from the night air, but her grip was firm. "Arthur Pembury, retired cartographer, Ordnance Survey. I drew maps for 41 years, and now I am attempting to discover what one does when one stops." "And what have you discovered?" "That one takes the night train to Edinburgh for no particularly urgent reason, apparently." Clara Mosley laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh that the wind snatched away almost before it was heard. And Arthur felt for the first time in a long time the particular satisfaction of having made a stranger laugh, which is a different and in some ways superior satisfaction to making a friend laugh, because it carries with it the element of discovery. "Shall we go inside?" he suggested. "The dining car may still be open, and I suspect we could both benefit from something warm that is not the wind." Clara looked once more at the sky, and Arthur, following her gaze, saw for the first time the stars, which had indeed appeared through a break in the clouds, a scattering of bright points against the velvet dark. And then she nodded and they went inside, and the heavy vestibule door closed behind them, and the roar of the night was replaced by the muffled rhythmic cradling sound of the train. The dining car was 3 carriages ahead. They walked through the connecting corridors together, passing through the gentle, swaying transitions between carriages where the floor shifted beneath their feet, and the coupling chains rattled softly, and the cold air leaked in through the gaps in the bellows. The corridors of the other carriages were dark and quiet. Most of the passengers had retired for the night. The compartment doors were closed, and the only light came from the small gas jets mounted at intervals along the ceiling, turned down to a dim blue flame that gave just enough illumination to navigate by. "Tea, please," Clara said, "and a sandwich if there's one to be had." "The same," Arthur said. "Thank you." They sat across from each other at the lamplit table, and the train rocked them gently, and the darkness flowed past the windows on either side like water. And Clara Mosley told Arthur Pembury about stars. She told him about the observatory at Kielder. It was not, she acknowledged, one of the great observatories of the world. Not Greenwich with its famous meridian line. Not the great telescopes of the American West built on mountaintops above the clouds. But it had one advantage that none of those famous institutions could match: darkness. The forests of Northumberland were the darkest place in England, she said. The nearest town of any size was 20 miles away, and the nearest city, Newcastle, was 40. On a clear night, standing at the dome of the small observatory above the tree line, you could see the Milky Way as a river of light running from horizon to horizon. And the stars were so numerous and so bright that they seemed not distant at all, but close. Close enough to hear, if only you knew how to listen. Arthur watched her face as she spoke, and he saw in it the same thing he had seen in his own face years ago, reflected in the brass plate of a theodolite on a hilltop in the Cheviots. It was the look of a person who has found the thing they were meant to do, and who cannot quite believe their luck. "You said you were traveling to Edinburgh," Arthur said as the steward brought their tea. A large brown teapot, 2 white china cups, a plate of ham sandwiches cut into triangles. "For work. For a meeting at the Royal Observatory on Blackford Hill. I have been invited to present my observations on variable stars. Stars whose brightness changes over time. It is considered rather niche even among astronomers, but it is my particular passion. I have been recording brightness variations in a set of stars and Cepheus for 3 years now, and I believe, though the senior astronomers at the Royal Society are not yet convinced, that the variations follow a predictable pattern that can be used to calculate distances." She paused and poured the tea with the confident, slightly impatient movements of a person whose mind works faster than her hands. "The problem," she continued, "is that no one takes the measurements of a woman particularly seriously, regardless of how accurate they are. I have been told in the most courteous possible language that my observations are interesting and worthy of further study, which is what men say when they mean we will wait for a man to confirm this before we believe it." She said this without bitterness, with a kind of weary clarity that suggested she had long ago accepted the landscape of her profession and had decided to map it rather than complain about it. "I know something about mapping difficult terrain," Arthur said, and he meant it in more ways than one. He told her about the Ordnance Survey, about the long days of field work, walking the hills and valleys with a theodolite and a chain, measuring the distance between points and the angles between lines of sight, building up triangle by triangle a picture of the land so precise that a stranger could use it to walk from one end of the country to the other without getting lost. He told her about the particular satisfaction of completing a map, of seeing the landscape reduced to lines and symbols on a page, the chaos of the real world ordered and clarified, every feature in its proper place. "But there is a cost to that precision," he said, turning his teacup slowly in his hands. "A map is always a simplification. Every map leaves something out. The sound of the wind in the grass, the color of the light at sunset, the way a valley feels when you stand at the top of the ridge and look down into it. These things are real as the contour lines and the triangulation points. But they cannot be measured. And what cannot be measured cannot be mapped. And what cannot be mapped, in the world of the Ordnance Survey, does not officially exist." He paused and took a sip of his tea and looked out at the darkness beyond the window. "I spent 41 years mapping the things that can be measured," he said, "and now I find myself rather more interested in the things that cannot." Clara leaned back in her chair and regarded him with an expression that combined interest and recognition, the look of someone who has heard their own thoughts expressed by another person in words they would not have chosen, but which are nonetheless exactly right. "You know," she said, "there is a word in astronomy for what you are describing. We call it seeing. Not seeing in the ordinary sense, not the act of looking with your eyes, but a technical term for the quality of the atmosphere on a given night. Good seeing means the air is steady, the stars are sharp, the images in the telescope are clear. Bad seeing means turbulence. The air is moving, the stars shimmer and blur. And no matter how fine your instrument, the images are distorted." She wrapped her hands around her teacup. "The interesting thing is that seeing is not a property of the stars. It is a property of the air between you and the stars. The stars themselves are perfectly steady. It is we, our instruments, our assumptions, our expectations, who make it blurry. And I sometimes think that the same is true of everything we try to understand. The thing itself is clear. It is the medium through which we observe it that introduces the distortion." "York," Arthur said, "the halfway point. We have been traveling for what? 3 hours, and we have 3 more ahead. Edinburgh by 6 if the schedule holds." "Do you know York?" Clara asked, looking out at the empty platform. "I know its coordinates," Arthur said. 53 degrees, 57 minutes north. 1 degree, 5 minutes west. I know the height of the Minster Tower, 235 feet, because I used it as a triangulation point in 1901. I know the width of the Ouse at Lindau Bridge and the depth of the city walls and the precise angle at which Stonegate meets St. Helens Square. He paused. But do I know York? I know everything about it that can be written down, which is, I suspect, not the same thing at all. The train stood at York for 8 minutes. Clara smiled at this, a slow, thoughtful smile that Arthur found he liked very much. And the train began to move again, pulling out of York with a series of gentle, progressive lurches, each one a little longer and a little faster than the last, until the rhythm re-established itself. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. And the dark countryside of the Vale of York spread itself around them, flat and open and moonlit, and Arthur could see far away to the west the long, dark line of the Pennines rising against the sky like the spine of a sleeping animal. Arthur considered this. It was not a question he had been asked before. People asked him about accuracy, about technique, about the mathematical methods of triangulation and the practical challenges of surveying in bad weather. No one had ever asked him about beauty. There is a moment, he said slowly, at the beginning of a new map, when you have the blank sheet in front of you and the landscape in front of you, and you must decide where to make the first mark. It is, I cannot describe it adequately, it is a moment of extraordinary intimacy. You are about to translate something vast and complex and alive into something flat and silent and still. You are about to commit an act of profound simplification. And in that moment before the pencil touches the paper, you understand that everything you draw will be both true and false. True because it corresponds to what is there. False because it leaves out everything that makes what is there worth seeing. He paused. The train rocked gently. The lamplight swayed. The most beautiful part of any map is the coastline, he said, because the coastline is where certainty ends. The land is fixed. You can measure it. You can triangulate it. You can pin it down. But the sea moves. The tide comes in and goes out. The boundary between land and water shifts twice a day, and the cartographer must draw a line that represents something that is in truth never still. The coastline on a map is an agreement between the cartographer and the ocean, a compromise. And I have always found that very beautiful. An agreement between the cartographer and the ocean, Clara repeated softly. That is a lovely way to think about it. Arthur looked at the columns of numbers, and he felt something stir in him, a recognition, a kinship. These numbers were in their way a map of light, a record of something distant and incomprehensible rendered into marks on a page, ordered, measured, made legible. We are in the same business, you and I, he said. We are both trying to draw the world. North of York the landscape changed. Arthur felt it in the motion of the train, the slight increase in effort, the longer, more labored breathing of the locomotive as the track began to climb. They were entering the foothills of the North York moors, and the flat vale was giving way to rolling country, the fields rising and falling in long, gentle waves broken by patches of dark woodland and the occasional glint of a stream catching the moonlight. The moon had emerged fully now, sailing clear of the clouds in a sky that was deepening from gray to black. The countryside was illuminated in its cold silver light, a landscape of shadows and highlights, of shapes without color, like a photograph or like one of the old copperplate engravings that Arthur remembered from the maps of his grandfather's era. Look, Clara said, and pointed out the window. Arthur looked and saw low on the northern horizon a bright star, brighter than the others, steady and unwinking, burning with a faint golden light. Capella, Clara said. Alpha Origi, the sixth brightest star in the sky, 42 light years away. The light you are seeing left that star in 1864. It has been traveling through space for 42 years, and it arrives here tonight at this window at this moment. For us. They sat in silence for a time after that, watching the stars through the dining car window. The train rocked them gently, and the tea grew cold in their cups. The young red-haired steward had retreated to the far end of the car and was polishing glasses with the slow, repetitive movements of a man who was fighting sleep and losing. The other tables were empty, the lamps on them extinguished, so that the only light in the car came from their own table lamp and from the stars beyond the glass. The warm amber human light and the cold white ancient light meeting at the window. Arthur found that he did not want to break the silence. It was a good silence, the kind that exists between two people who have discovered that they do not need to speak in order to communicate, who have found in the space of a few hours and a pot of tea a shared frequency, a common language that is not made of words but of attention, of the quality of looking, of the willingness to be still and to notice. He thought of Catherine. She had understood silence. She had been a woman who could sit beside him for an entire evening reading her book while he worked on his maps, and the silence between them had been not empty but full of presence, full of the unspoken knowledge of each other that accumulates over decades of shared life, like sediment on a riverbed. Invisible but deep. At Darlington, the train stopped for 6 minutes. Arthur and Clara remained in the dining car, and Clara told him about the night sky in winter. She told him how the great constellation of Orion dominated the southern sky from November to March, how the 3 stars of Orion's belt pointed downward to Sirius, the brightest star in the entire sky, and upward to Aldebaran, the red eye of Taurus the bull. She traced the patterns on the condensation that had formed on the inside of the dining car window, drawing the stars with her fingertip on the cold, wet glass. Betelgeuse here, Rigel there, the Pleiades, a smudged cluster in the upper right. And Arthur watched her finger move across the glass and thought that she was in her way making a map. The most temporary and the most beautiful map he had ever seen. A map drawn in water on glass that would evaporate before the train reached Newcastle. The ancients thought the stars were fixed, Clara said, her fingers still resting on the glass where she had placed the Pleiades. Immovable, eternal, the fixed stars, they called them. And they are, from our perspective. A human lifetime is too short to see them move. But they do move. Every star in the sky is in motion, rotating, orbiting, drifting through space. And in 100,000 years the constellations we know will be unrecognizable. Orion will dissolve. The plow will scatter. The patterns we see are temporary. Accidents of perspective. Of our particular position in space at this particular moment in time. She withdrew her hand from the glass, and the star map glistened for a moment in the lamplight, and then began to fade. Everything is temporary, she said. But that does not make it less real. The train climbed through County Durham, and Arthur, who knew this country well, who had spent 3 years surveying its hills and valleys, its coal fields, and its river gorges, felt the familiar tug of recognition that a landscape exerts on a person who has walked it and mapped it and carried it ever since in the contours of their memory. I mapped this stretch, he said, gesturing toward the dark window through which nothing was visible now but the faint reflection of their own lamplit table floating in the blackness. In 1892, the country between Darlington and Durham. It took 3 months, and it rained for most of them. I wore out 2 pairs of boots and broke a theodolite and was charged by a bull in a field near a cliff. Charged by a bull, Clara said with evident interest. A shorthorn, very large, very determined. I abandoned the theodolite and climbed a dry stone wall with a speed that I have never since been able to replicate. The theodolite survived. I was required to write a formal report explaining the damage to my trousers. It was, I believe, the most carefully worded document I have ever produced. Clara laughed. That short, surprised laugh again, caught and held for a moment before it was absorbed by the rhythm of the train. And Arthur felt again that small, unexpected warmth. North of Durham, the steward approached their table with an apologetic expression and informed them that the dining car would be closing in 15 minutes as the kitchen was required to prepare for the morning breakfast service. Of course, Arthur said. We have trespassed on your hospitality long enough. Thank you. The tea was excellent and the shortbread was inspired. The steward, whose name Clara had discovered during one of Arthur's visits to the lavatory, was William, and who was 19 years old and saving money to study medicine in Edinburgh, blushed and retreated. Arthur and Clara gathered themselves to return to their compartments. Arthur placed his napkin on the table with the neat folded precision that characterized all his actions. Clara tucked her leather notebook back into her coat pocket. They stood and the train swayed beneath them, and for a moment they both reached for the same brass handrail, and their hands met. Briefly, accidentally, a contact that lasted less than a second, but that Arthur registered with the heightened sensitivity of a man for whom human touch had become in recent years an uncommon event. And they walked back through the swaying corridors, past the darkened compartments, past the sleeping passengers, through the cold, connecting vestibules, toward the sleeping car at the rear of the train. They reached the sleeping car corridor and stood between their compartment doors. Arthur's compartment 6 on the right, Clara's compartment 5 on the left. The narrowness of the corridor meant that they stood very close together, closer than either would have stood in a drawing room or a street. And the intimacy of this proximity was both accidental and, Arthur thought, not entirely unwelcome. "Thank you for the evening," Clara said. Her voice was soft. The noise of the train seemed to recede around them, creating a small pocket of stillness in the rushing dark. Arthur looked at her in the dim gaslight of the corridor and found that he did not want to say goodnight. It was a feeling he had not experienced in a very long time. This reluctance to let a conversation end, this sense that the words between two people had created a space that would collapse the moment they stopped speaking. He had felt it with Catherine in the early days of their courtship, that breathless unwillingness to be the first to turn away, and he was surprised to find it here, in the narrow corridor of a sleeping car, at 1 o'clock in the morning, with a woman he had met less than 2 hours ago. "Thank you for the company," he said. "It has been a long time since I have talked to anyone about maps and found that they were genuinely interested. Most people, when they learn what I did for a living, develop a glassy expression that suggests they are calculating how quickly they can change the subject." Clara smiled. "I know that expression well. It is the same one I receive when I mention variable stars. People hear the word star, and they think of something romantic and poetic. And then I start talking about photometric magnitudes and periodic luminosity functions, and the romance evaporates rather quickly." "Their loss," Arthur said, and meant it. "Good night, Mr. Pembury." "Good night, Miss Mosley." She opened the door to compartment 5 and stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with a soft click. Arthur stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the small sounds of her settling in. The rustle of her coat being hung up, the soft thud of a boot being removed, the creak of the bed as she sat down. These sounds were oddly intimate, the sounds of a private life conducted on the other side of a thin wooden wall, and Arthur felt a pang of something that was not quite loneliness, but was adjacent to it, the way a river is adjacent to the valley it has carved. He entered his own compartment and closed the door. The gas lamp was still burning at its lowest setting, the small blue-gold bead of flame casting just enough light to see by. His nightshirt lay on the pillow where he had placed it. His compass sat on the fold-down shelf, its needle pointing steadily north. His Stevenson lay beside it, the bookmark holding his place in the chapter where David Balfour first meets Alan Breck Stewart on the deck of the Covenant. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed and removed his shoes, placing them side by side on the floor with the toes pointing outward, as he had done every night of his adult life. He removed his waistcoat and folded it, and placed it on top of his suit jacket on the brass hook. He loosened his necktie and pulled it free of his collar and rolled it into a neat cylinder and tucked it into the pocket of his jacket. Then he unbuttoned his collar and removed it and placed it on the mahogany cabinet, and he sat for a moment in his shirt and trousers, feeling the train rock beneath him, feeling the vibration of the wheels through the bed frame, through the floor, through the soles of his stockinged feet. The train was climbing now. He could feel it in the slight backward tilt of the compartment, in the deeper, more effortful sound of the locomotive, in the way the rhythm of the wheels had slowed almost imperceptibly. They were north of Durham, approaching the high ground that separates the Valley of the Wear from the Valley of the Tyne. Arthur knew this stretch of railway well. He had traveled it dozens of times during his years with the survey, and he had mapped the country on either side of it, the rolling hills and deep-cut valleys of the Durham coalfield to the south, the broader, more open landscape of Northumberland to the north. He thought about what Clara had said about seeing, about the quality of the atmosphere between the observer and the thing observed, about how the stars themselves are perfectly steady, and it is the medium through which we look at them that introduces the distortion. He thought about this for a long time, turning the idea over in his mind the way he might turn a compass in his hand, examining it from different angles. In his years with the Ordnance Survey, he had been trained to believe that accuracy was the highest virtue, that the purpose of observation was to eliminate error, to strip away distortion, to arrive at a measurement that corresponded as closely as possible to the thing being measured. The good surveyor was the one who could account for every source of error, the curvature of the earth, the refraction of the atmosphere, the expansion of the measuring chain in warm weather, and correct for them. producing a result that was as close to the truth as human instruments could achieve. He changed into his nightshirt and folded his trousers and placed them on the hook with his other clothes, and he climbed into the bed and pulled the dark green blanket up to his chest. The sheets were cool and smooth and smelled faintly of lavender, which was Catherine's smell, and for a moment the association was so strong and so unexpected that he had to close his eyes and wait for it to pass. It did not pass exactly. It softened. It became something he could hold without being held by it. Catherine had died in January of 1902, in the bedroom of their house in Highgate, in the bed they had shared for 34 years. She had been ill for 8 months, a cancer that had begun in her breast and spread with the patient, inexorable thoroughness of an advancing tide. Arthur had watched her diminish, had watched the woman he knew recede behind the illness the way a landscape recedes behind fog, still there, still real, but increasingly unreachable. In the last weeks, she had been very quiet. She had lain in the bed with her eyes closed most of the time, her breathing shallow, her hands resting on the blanket like two small birds that had forgotten how to fly. Arthur had sat beside her, holding her hand, reading to her from the books she loved. Jane Austen mostly. Persuasion was her favorite. She had read it so many times that the spine was cracked and the pages were soft with handling and certain passages were underlined in pencil. And Arthur, reading these underlined passages aloud, had felt that he was reading not just Austen's words, but Catherine's thoughts, the ideas and sentiments that she had found important enough to mark. There was one passage she had asked him to read again and again in those final days. It was Captain Wentworth's letter to an Eliot. "You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. Tell me not that I am too late, that such precious feelings are gone forever." Arthur had read these words to her so many times that he had memorized them without intending to, and now they lived in his mind alongside the heights of mountains and the coordinates of trigonometric stations, permanent fixtures in the landscape of his memory. She had died on a Tuesday morning in January. It had been snowing. Arthur had been sitting beside the bed holding her hand and reading Persuasion, and at some point he had become aware that her breathing had changed, had become slower and more widely spaced. And then it had stopped, and the room which had been full of the small sounds of her dying was suddenly empty, and the snow was falling past the window, and the world continued as though nothing had happened, which was the most incomprehensible thing of all. He had not known what to do with himself after that. The house was too large and too quiet. Every room contained her absence. The chair where she had sat to read, the garden she had tended, the kitchen where she had made tea every afternoon at 4 o'clock precisely. A habit so regular that Arthur had used it as a reference point, the way a surveyor uses a trigonometric station, a fixed point from which to measure everything else. He had returned to work. The Ordnance Survey had been understanding. His colleagues had been kind in the awkward, well-meaning way that English men are kind in the face of grief, which is to say they had shaken his hand firmly and told him they were sorry, and then changed the subject to something practical. And Arthur had been grateful for this because he was an Englishman too, and he understood that grief in England is a private matter, conducted behind closed doors and stiff upper lips. And the kindest thing one can do for a grieving man is to give him something useful to do. So he had done useful things. He had completed the survey of the Northumberland coast. He had revised the maps of the Scottish borders. He had trained a new generation of surveyors in the methods of triangulation and the proper care of instruments. And he had retired 18 months ago, at the age of 62, because the survey had a mandatory retirement age, and even a man who had given 41 years of service was not exempt from its rules. Retirement had been, Arthur reflected as the train rocked him gently in his narrow bed, the most difficult landscape he had ever been asked to navigate. A landscape without landmarks, without contourlines, without the reassuring grid of latitude and longitude that had structured every day of his working life. He woke each morning in the house in Highgate, and the day stretched before him, featureless and undifferentiated, like the Cambridgeshire fens, and he had to decide for himself where to go and what to do, which was a freedom he had never wanted and did not know how to use. He had joined a walking club. He had taken up watercolor painting, at which he was adequate but not gifted. He had volunteered at the Royal Geographical Society, where he catalogued maps in the archive, handling documents that were in some cases centuries old, maps drawn by men who had believed that the world ended at the edge of their knowledge, that beyond the known lands there were only monsters, and the abyss. He envied these early cartographers sometimes, not their ignorance, but their certainty. They had known where the boundaries were. The edge of the map was the edge of the world. Beyond it, nothing. But Arthur's world had no edges. It stretched in every direction, boundless and unmapped, and he was alone in it with a compass that pointed north but could not tell him why north mattered. This trip to Edinburgh was an example. He had no particular reason to go. There was no meeting to attend, no friend to visit, no professional obligation to fulfill. He had simply woken one morning the previous week and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, that he needed to be somewhere else. Not anywhere specific, just elsewhere. The night train to Edinburgh had presented itself as a possibility, and he had taken it, the way a man lost in unfamiliar country might follow a path not because he knows where it leads, but because it is the only path available and standing still is not an option. He lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sound of the train. The rhythm had changed again. They were descending now, the track falling away from the high ground toward the valley of the Tyne, and the locomotive was easing back, its breathing lighter, its effort reduced, the weight of the train pushing it forward on the downhill grade. Through the window, which Arthur had left uncurtained, he could see the sky, and the sky was full of stars. He had never paid much attention to stars. He was a man of the earth, literally, a man who had spent his life looking down, at the ground beneath his feet, at the shape of the land, at the way the contours folded and unfolded across the surface of the planet. The sky had been, for him, primarily a source of weather. Good weather meant good surveying conditions. Bad weather meant wet notebooks and unreliable readings and the risk of pneumonia. He had noted the positions of the sun and the moon because they were useful for determining direction and time, but the stars had been merely decorative, pretty but irrelevant, like the ornamental borders on an old map. But Clara had changed something. Not dramatically, not in the way that a landscape changes when an earthquake reshapes it. More in the way that a landscape changes when the light shifts, when the sun emerges from behind a cloud, and suddenly every contour and texture that was invisible a moment ago becomes vivid and clear. She had shown him that the stars were not decorative. They were not merely pretty. They were data. They were information. They were a map of the universe, as precise and as legible as any map he had ever drawn, if only you knew how to read them. 42 light years, she had said of Capella. The light you are seeing left that star in 1864. In 1864, Arthur had been 22 years old, a junior surveyor with the Ordnance Survey, walking the hills of the Lake District with a chain and a notebook, learning his trade. He had been young and strong and certain of his place in the world, and the light that he was now seeing through the window of a sleeping car had left a distant sun at the very moment when he was beginning the work that would define his life. The thought was vertiginous. It made him feel simultaneously very small and very large, very temporary and very connected, as though the light from that distant star had been traveling all this time specifically to reach him, specifically to arrive at this window at this moment, carrying with it a message from his own past. He remembered his first day with the Ordnance Survey, September of 1863. He had been 21 years old, the son of a schoolmaster from Dorset, educated at the grammar school in Dorchester, and then at University College London, where he had studied mathematics and natural philosophy. He had applied to the survey because he loved maps, had loved them since childhood, since the day his father had unrolled a large Ordnance Survey map of Dorset on the kitchen table and shown him how to read it. Look, his father had said, pointing to a spot on the map. This is where we are. This is our house. And this line here, this is the lane that runs past the church. And this is the church. And if you follow this contour line, the one marked 200, you can see that the hill behind the church rises to 200 feet. And if you walk to the top of that hill and look south, you will see the sea, because the next contour line drops away to the coast, here, and then there is nothing between you and France. Arthur had been 8 years old, and the idea that the world could be represented on a piece of paper, that the hills and valleys and rivers and roads that he walked through every day could be translated into lines and symbols and numbers, had struck him with the force of a revelation. It was, he would later realize, the moment that determined the course of his life. The moment when he understood that the world could be read, that it had a language, and that he wanted to learn it. His first survey had been a triangulation of a small area of the Surrey Downs. working under the supervision of a senior surveyor named Blackwood, a taciturn Scotsman of immense experience and very few words who communicated primarily through grunts and pointed silences. Blackwood had taught Arthur everything that mattered about surveying, not by explaining, but by demonstrating, by doing the work with a precision and a patience that made instruction unnecessary. "Watch," Blackwood would say, the only word he seemed to consider essential, and Arthur would watch, and he would learn. He learned how to set up a theodolite on uneven ground, adjusting the leveling screws until the bubble was perfectly centered. He learned how to read the verniers, the tiny graduated scales that allowed angles to be measured to a fraction of a second of arc. He learned how to stretch a measuring chain across a field, keeping it taut and level, accounting for the sag in the middle and the slope of the ground. He learned how to compute a triangulation, working through the trigonometry with a pencil and a table of logarithms, checking and rechecking his calculations until he was certain that the result was correct. And he learned something else, something that Blackwood never put into words, but that Arthur absorbed through years of working alongside him. He learned that accuracy is not merely a technical achievement. It is a moral one. That the man who measures the world carefully and records what he finds without embellishment or distortion is performing an act of honesty. That the map is a promise made to the stranger who will use it, a promise that the lines on the page correspond to something real, and that this promise must be kept. The train passed through Newcastle. Arthur heard it rather than saw it, heard the change in the sound as the train entered the station, the echo of the roof overhead, the brief cessation of the wind noise, the voices on the platform, muffled and distant. He did not open his eyes. He felt the train stop and start again, heard the doors and the whistle, felt the lurch of departure, and then the rhythm resumed, and the train was climbing again, heading north through the Northumberland night toward the Scottish border. He thought about the maps he had made. Hundreds of them. Thousands perhaps, if you counted every sheet and every revision. Maps of the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales, of the Pennines and the Cheviots, of the Northumberland coast and the Scottish lowlands. Each one a record of a particular place at a particular time, a snapshot of the landscape frozen in ink and paper. But the landscape was never frozen. It was always changing, always being reshaped by weather and erosion and human activity, by new roads and new buildings and new field boundaries. The map was always out of date the moment it was printed. The world it described had already moved on. This was the cartographer's dilemma, the paradox at the heart of his profession. The map aspired to permanence, but the territory it represented was impermanent. The map said here is a river, and the river changed course. The map said here is a forest, and the forest was felled. The map said here is a village, and the village grew into a town. The cartographer drew the world as it was, and the world immediately became something else, and the cartographer had to begin again, revising, updating, redrawing, in an endless cycle of representation and obsolescence. He opened his eyes. The compartment was dark except for the blue-gold bead of the gas lamp and the starlight from the window. The stars were extraordinary now. The train had left the coal fields behind and was traveling through open country, and the sky was enormous, a vast dome of black velvet sewn with silver, and Arthur, who had spent 64 years looking at the ground, found himself looking up and seeing for the first time what Clara saw every night from her observatory in the Northumberland forest. The Milky Way was visible, a broad pale band of light stretching from the southern horizon to the northern, dividing the sky into two halves. It was not a river of light, as Clara had described it. It was more like a road, Arthur thought, a road that led from somewhere to somewhere else, from one end of the universe to the other, and he was a traveler on it, a man on a train, moving along a track that ran parallel to this celestial highway, two journeys superimposed, one on the earth and one in the sky, both heading north. There was a knock on his compartment door. Soft, tentative. Not the professional knock of Fenton, but something lighter and less certain. It was Clara's voice, low and slightly breathless. "Yes," Arthur said, sitting up in bed and pulling the blanket around his shoulders. He should have said no. He was 64 years old. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. He was in his nightshirt. The conventions of the age, the elaborate unspoken rules that govern the behavior of men and women in Edwardian England, required him to decline politely, to wish her good night, to remain in his compartment behind his closed door. These conventions existed for good reasons. They protected reputations. They maintained order. They kept the complex machinery of social life running smoothly by ensuring that certain situations that might lead to confusion or impropriety or the entanglement of feelings, were avoided altogether. Arthur Pembury had obeyed these conventions his entire life. He had been a man of propriety and discretion, a man who kept his feelings behind a carefully maintained facade of professional competence and personal reserve. He had loved Catherine deeply and faithfully and had never, in 36 years of marriage, given her cause to doubt his loyalty. He had conducted himself at all times with the dignity and restraint expected of a senior civil servant and a gentleman. He dressed quickly, pulling his trousers on over his nightshirt, which was not elegant but was practical, and putting on his shoes without bothering with the laces. He put on his waistcoat and his overcoat, because he knew from experience that the vestibule between carriages was bitterly cold, and he took his compass from the fold-down shelf and put it in his pocket, not because he needed it, but because it was part of who he was. And then he opened the door and stepped into the corridor. Clara was waiting. She had put her green traveling coat on over what appeared to be her nightdress, a white cotton garment visible at the collar and hem, and she had put her boots on but not laced them, and her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders in dark waves, and she looked, Arthur thought, like a person who had been interrupted in the middle of a dream and had brought some of the dream with her into the waking world. "Come," she said, and she turned and walked toward the end of the carriage, and Arthur followed her through the narrow corridor, past the closed doors of the sleeping compartments where other passengers lay in their narrow beds dreaming their private dreams, and she opened the heavy door at the end of the carriage and stepped out onto the vestibule, and Arthur stepped out after her, and the cold hit him like a wall. But Arthur was not looking down. He was looking up, because the sky above them was like nothing he had ever seen. Arthur stared. He could not help it. He stood on the rattling, vibrating vestibule of a sleeping car traveling through the Northumberland night at 50 miles an hour, and he stared at the sky with his mouth slightly open and his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, and he felt something that he had not felt in a very long time. He felt wonder, not the mild aesthetic pleasure that he felt when he looked at a well-drawn map or a handsome locomotive or a particularly fine sunset, but wonder, the real thing, the deep, disorienting, ego-dissolving thing. The feeling of being very small in the presence of something very large. The feeling that the world was bigger and stranger and more beautiful than he had known. "My God," he said, and the wind took the words away. "There," she said, pointing. She had to lean close to him to be heard above the noise of the train, and her mouth was near his ear, and he could feel her breath warm against his cold skin. "That is Orion. The 3 bright stars in a row. There. That is his belt. Alnitak, Alnilam, Mintaka. And above them, the red one, that is Betelgeuse, a red supergiant. If you placed it where our sun is, its surface would extend past the orbit of Mars. It is so large that our entire solar system could fit inside it with room to spare. And below the belt, the bright blue-white one, that is Rigel, one of the brightest stars in our galaxy, 70,000 times more luminous than the sun." Arthur looked where she pointed, and he saw Orion. He had seen Orion before, of course. Everyone in England had seen Orion, the great winter constellation, visible from any back garden on any clear night between November and March. But he had never seen it like this. He had never seen it from a moving train in the middle of the Northumberland hills with the clouds gone and the air clear, and a woman who understood what she was looking at standing beside him explaining what these lights were. The constellation was enormous. It filled the southern sky, its bright stars blazing against the black, and Arthur could see now what he had never seen before, that the stars were different colors. Betelgeuse was red, a deep warm red like the embers of a dying fire. Rigel was blue-white, the cold, fierce blue of a gas flame or the heart of a glacier. The belt stars were white, pure and steady. And around and between these bright stars, fainter ones clustered and gathered, dozens of them, hundreds, forming a background of light that gave the constellation depth and texture, so that Orion seemed not flat but three-dimensional, a figure standing in space rather than painted on a surface. And there, Clara continued, still pointing, still close, her voice threading through the noise of the wind and the wheels. "Below the belt, that faint smudge of light. Can you see it? That is the Orion Nebula, a cloud of gas and dust where new stars are being born. Right now, at this moment, while we stand here on this train, new stars are condensing out of that cloud, igniting, beginning to burn. The universe is not finished. It is still being made. Arthur looked at the faint smudge of light below Orion's belt and tried to comprehend what she was telling him. A cloud of gas and dust. New stars being born. The universe still being made. These were not ideas that fit comfortably in the mind of a man who had spent 41 years measuring things with a chain and a theodolite. His world had been solid, fixed, measurable. The hills did not move. The rivers did not vanish. The trigonometric stations stayed where they were put. But here was Clara telling him that the sky was a workshop, that the universe was under construction, that even the stars were temporary. And he found that instead of disturbing him, this idea filled him with a strange exhilaration. "Show me more," he said. She showed him the Pleiades, that cluster of young blue stars in Taurus that she had come out here to find in the first place. They were visible now, high in the eastern sky, a tight group of tiny blue-white points that seemed to tremble in the cold air. 6 or 7 were visible to the naked eye, but Clara told him that there were in fact hundreds of stars in the cluster, most of them too faint to see without a telescope, and that the cluster was about 440 light-years away, which meant that the light reaching his eyes at this moment had left those stars before the English Civil War, before Shakespeare, before the printing press, when the Wars of the Roses were still being fought and Richard III still sat on the throne of England. She showed him Aldebaran, the red eye of Taurus, a giant star 65 light-years away, its light the color of autumn leaves. She showed him Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, blazing low on the southeastern horizon like a diamond on fire, its light fractured by the atmosphere into flashes of blue and white and red. She showed him the constellation of Gemini, the twins Castor and Pollux standing side by side in the eastern sky, and she told him the myth, how Castor and Pollux were brothers, one mortal and one divine. And when Castor was killed in battle, Pollux begged Zeus to let him share his immortality with his brother, and Zeus placed them both in the sky, where they would never be separated again. Arthur listened to all of this standing at the iron railing of the vestibule with the cold wind cutting through his overcoat and his unlaced shoes and his nightshirt, and he felt the years falling away from him, the weight of his retirement and his widowhood and his 64 years of careful measured life lifting from his shoulders like a coat being removed. He felt young, not in his body, which was cold and stiff and reminded him at every joint and every muscle that it was 2:30 in the morning and he was standing on a moving train in November without adequate clothing. But in his mind, in his capacity for astonishment, in his willingness to look at something he had never really looked at before and to admit that it was extraordinary. "You must think me very ignorant," he said to Clara, "not to have known any of this." She said this with a warmth and a simplicity that Arthur found deeply affecting. There was no condescension in it, no suggestion that her knowledge was superior to his, just a straightforward acknowledgement that the world was large and that no single perspective could encompass it, and that there was value in seeing it through someone else's eyes. But he had never seen these hills from a train at night with the stars overhead and the moon casting its silver light across the moorland. He had never seen the landscape he knew so well rendered in this alien vocabulary of shadow and light, stripped of the detail he was accustomed to, the hedgerows and field boundaries and footpaths and streams, and reduced to its essential forms, the long sweep of the ridges, the deep cut of the valleys, the way the land rose and fell in great slow waves like the surface of a frozen sea. It was, he realized, a different kind of map. The moonlight was making a map of the landscape, a map that showed not the details but the structure, not the features but the form. It was the kind of map that a sculptor might make, or a poet, a map that was less concerned with where things were than with what they were, less concerned with accuracy than with truth. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked. Clara looked at him. In the starlight and the moonlight her face was pale and clear, her dark eyes luminous, and he saw in her expression something that he recognized, because he was feeling it himself. It was the expression of a person who has unexpectedly found in a stranger a mirror for their own thoughts. Not agreement exactly, not the comfortable similarity of people who think alike, but something more interesting and more rare. The kind of recognition that occurs when two very different perspectives converge on the same truth, approaching it from opposite directions and meeting in the middle, like two surveyors who have triangulated the same point from different hilltops and discovered that their measurements agree. "We should go inside," Clara said at last. "You are shivering." He was shivering. He had not noticed until she mentioned it, but now that she had, he realized that he was very cold indeed, his hands numb on the iron railing, his feet like blocks of ice in his unlaced shoes, the wind cutting through his overcoat and his nightshirt and chilling him to the bone. The cold had been held at bay by the intensity of the experience, by the stars and the conversation and the strange exhilaration of being awake and alive in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. But now it came rushing in, filling the spaces that wonder had temporarily occupied. "Thank you," Arthur said, "for showing me the stars. I feel as though I have been given a new map, one I did not know I needed." "You are a good man, Mr. Pembury," she said, "and you are not as lost as you think you are." She released his hand and opened the door to her compartment and stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Arthur stood in the corridor. His hand was warm where she had held it. The rest of him was cold. The train rocked gently. The gas lamp flickered. The wheels sang their paired song. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. He entered his compartment and closed the door. He removed his overcoat and his trousers and his shoes and climbed back into the narrow bed. The sheets which had been cool when he left were cold now, and he lay shivering for a few minutes until his body heat warmed them. He pulled the dark green blanket up to his chin and lay on his side, facing the window and the stars. He thought about what Clara had said. "You are not as lost as you think you are." He turned these words over in his mind the way he might turn the compass in his pocket, examining them from different angles, testing their accuracy. He had been lost. He was fairly certain of that. Lost in the way that a man is lost when the landmarks he has relied on are no longer there, when the map he has been following is no longer accurate, when the terrain has changed and the old routes no longer lead where they used to. He had been lost since Catherine's death, lost in the big empty house in Highgate, lost in the featureless landscape of retirement, lost in the silence that filled the spaces where her voice used to be. But tonight, standing on the vestibule of a sleeping car with the stars overhead and Clara Mosley beside him, he had felt something shift. Not a dramatic revelation, not a sudden clarity, more like the moment in surveying when you take a bearing from a new station and suddenly the position that was uncertain becomes fixed, and the map that was incomplete acquires a new reference point, and the landscape that was confusing begins to make sense. He was not found. He was not there yet, but he was, perhaps, beginning to get his bearings. The train crossed the border into Scotland somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning. Arthur did not see the border. There was no marker, no sign, no visible change in the landscape. The hills on the Scottish side looked exactly like the hills on the English side, which was logical because they were the same hills. They were the Cheviots, and they did not recognize national boundaries. They had been there long before England and Scotland existed as nations, and would be there long after those nations had changed beyond recognition. The border was a line on a map, nothing more, an agreement between cartographers and politicians, and the land on either side of it was indifferent to the agreement. But Arthur felt the border all the same. He felt it in the way that a person who has crossed the same threshold many times feels it, as a subtle shift in the quality of the air, a change in the texture of the silence, a sense of having left one place and entered another, even though the two places are separated by nothing more than an imaginary line. He had always loved Scotland. He had spent years working there, mapping the lowlands and the borders, the river valleys and the coastal plains, and he had come to know the Scottish landscape with an intimacy that was different from his knowledge of the English landscape, more romantic perhaps, more touched with wildness and melancholy. The Scottish hills had a quality that the English hills lacked, a kind of sternness, a grandeur that was not diminished but enhanced by their bareness, by the absence of the hedgerows and copses and village greens that softened the English landscape and made it feel domesticated and tame. Catherine had loved Scotland too. They had spent their honeymoon in Edinburgh in the autumn of 1866, staying in a small hotel on the Royal Mile, walking the steep cobbled streets and climbing Arthur's Seat and visiting the castle and the cathedral and the botanical gardens. Arthur remembered those days with a clarity that surprised him. The way Catherine had laughed when they reached the top of Arthur's Seat and the wind had nearly blown her hat off, The way she had taken his arm as they walked down the Royal Mile in the rain. The way she had looked at him across the breakfast table in the hotel dining room with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that he had felt his heart expand in his chest like a balloon filling with warm air. They had returned to Edinburgh many times after that, sometimes together and sometimes, when his work required it, separately, and each visit had added a new layer to their shared knowledge of the city, a new restaurant discovered, a new street explored, a new view admired from a new vantage point, until Edinburgh had become for them not just a place on the map, but a place in their marriage. A city that belonged to them in the way that certain songs and certain books and certain private jokes belonged to them, things that carried a weight of shared meaning that was invisible to anyone else. He thought about Clara's observations of Delta Cephei, the variable star in Cepheus, its brightness rising and falling over a period of 5 days, 8 hours, and 47 minutes. Regular as a heartbeat, she had said. He thought about the implications of her work, the idea that these regular variations could be used to calculate distances. If you knew how bright a star actually was, its intrinsic brightness, and you could measure how bright it appeared to be, its apparent brightness, then the difference between the two would tell you how far away the star was. The principle was elegant and simple, like all the best scientific ideas, and Arthur could see immediately why Clara was excited about it. It would give astronomers a way of measuring the universe, of determining the distances to stars and galaxies that were far beyond the reach of any direct measurement. It would be, in effect, a new kind of surveying, a triangulation of the cosmos. And he could see equally well why the senior astronomers were reluctant to accept it. Not because the idea was wrong, but because the person proposing it was a woman, and the men who controlled the institutions of astronomy were not accustomed to having their understanding of the universe revised by a woman working alone in a small observatory in the Northumberland forest. Clara had described the problem with characteristic clarity and without self-pity, and Arthur admired her for this. Admired her refusal to be either defeated by the prejudice she encountered or consumed by anger at it. She reminded him in some ways of Catherine, not in appearance or manner. Catherine had been fair-haired and gentle and quiet, a woman who expressed her strength through patience and steadiness rather than through the direct, outspoken confidence that characterized Clara. But both women shared something fundamental, a quality that Arthur could only describe as integrity, a refusal to pretend to be less than they were, a commitment to seeing the world clearly and to telling the truth about what they saw, regardless of whether the truth was welcome or convenient. The train descended from the Cheviots into the Scottish lowlands, and the landscape changed. The bare moorland hills gave way to rolling farmland, the stone walls to hedgerows, the heather to pasture. The first farms appeared, their buildings dark and silent, their fields silver in the moonlight. A river glinted in a valley below the railway, and Arthur knew without looking at a map that this was the Tweed, the great border river, winding its way east toward the sea at Berwick. He had mapped the Tweed Valley in 1895. He remembered the work with particular pleasure because the weather had been fine, the countryside beautiful, and the local people hospitable. He had stayed with a farmer and his wife near Kelso, a couple named Turnbull, who had fed him enormous breakfasts of porridge and eggs and bacon and toast, and had refused to let him pay for his lodging because, as Mr. Turnbull had explained with the unanswerable logic of a border farmer, any man who walked 20 miles a day in the service of his country deserved a bed and a meal. And if the government was too mean to provide them, then it fell to honest folk to make up the difference. The sky was beginning to change. It was not yet dawn, not by a long way, but the quality of the darkness was different now. The stars in the east were slightly less bright, as though a very thin, very transparent curtain had been drawn across them. The horizon in the east was no longer black, but the very darkest shade of blue, a blue so dark that it was almost indistinguishable from black, but not quite, not quite. And Arthur, lying in his narrow bed watching through the window, saw this change, and knew that the night was ending and the day was beginning, and that the long journey from London to Edinburgh was entering its final hours. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to rest, to lie in the rocking darkness and let the sound of the train wash over him. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. The rhythm was different now, or perhaps he was hearing it differently. It sounded less like a heartbeat and more like a voice, a low, steady, murmuring voice, saying something that he could not quite make out, something that was not words exactly, but was meaningful nonetheless. The way the wind in the grass is meaningful. The way the sound of a river is meaningful. The way the silence between two people who understand each other is meaningful. He thought about what he would do in Edinburgh. He had no plan, no appointments, no obligations. He would check into a hotel, he supposed. Something modest and comfortable. He would walk the streets. He would visit the places he and Catherine had visited, not to mourn but to remember, to pay his respects to the past while acknowledging that the past was past and could not be revisited, only remembered. He would climb Arthur's Seat if his legs were up to it. He would stand at the top and look out over the city and the Firth of Forth, and he would think about Catherine and about Clara and about maps and stars and coastlines and all the places where certainty ends and something else begins. And he wondered, lying in the dark with the stars fading in the east and the Scottish lowlands unrolling beyond the window, whether he would see Clara again. Whether the Edinburgh sleeper had brought them together for one night only, a brief conjunction of two orbits that would not intersect again, or whether this meeting was the beginning of something, a new line on the map, a new reference point from which other positions could be determined. He did not know, and for the first time in a long time, he found that not knowing was not frightening. It was, in its way, exciting. It was the feeling he had had at the beginning of every new survey, standing on an unfamiliar hillside with a blank sheet of paper and a theodolite, looking out at a landscape he had never seen before and knowing that his job was to make sense of it, to find the landmarks and measure the distances and draw the lines that would turn this unknown territory into something legible and navigable. He lay in the narrow bed and listened to the wheels and felt the rocking and watched the stars fade slowly in the east. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, in that borderland territory that belongs to neither state and both, he found something that he had not been looking for and had not expected to find. He found peace. Not happiness exactly. Not the robust, uncomplicated contentment that he had known in his working years. But peace. A quiet settling of the mind, like sediment settling in still water. A sense that things were in their proper place, even if that place was not where he had expected them to be. The train rocked him. The wheels sang. The stars faded. And Arthur Pembury, retired cartographer of the Ordnance Survey, lay in his narrow bed on the Edinburgh sleeper and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that the compass needle was steady.